Okay. So before we could continue, there's so many moving parts here we have to put together. So this whole sugya started with discussion. We know that if you have a behemoth that's a treifa and you shecht it, even though you're not allowed to eat it because it's a treifa, but the shechita stops it from becoming a nevela, and therefore it won't be tummy. That's by a behemoth. What about by a knife? So the Mishnah brings a three-way machlokes. We have the Shita of Rav Meir, who holds not only does the shechita of the oif, that's a treifa, prevent it from becoming tamei, but even the malika of an oif will prevent it from becoming tamei. Rabbi Yehuda is on the opposite end of the spectrum, and Rabbi Yehuda holds to the contrary. Even the shechita of an oif will not protect it from becoming a nevela. And Rabbi Yosy came up the middle. He said the shechita will protect an oif treifa from becoming tamei, but the malika won't. And the question is, where did these shitas come from? So Reb Meir is who was introduced first, and Reb Meir said it seems to be a kabbalah, because if you had to compare the tumah of a behema, of a nevela, a behema that's a nevela, to the tumah of the nevela of an oif, everybody would agree hands down that the tumah of the behema is much more severe, because it becomes tumah merely by touching it, or even if you don't touch it, even if you carry it without coming into direct contact with it, you'll be tumah. The tumah of an oif, you only become tummy if you swallow it. That's a much harder way to become tummy. So the reasoning is as follows: if even the tumah of Neveila behema, which is so severe, still becomes solved through shechita, surely the tumah Neveila of a bird should be solved with a shechita, even though it was a treifa. That's what the Kavachem of Reb Meir was. Reb Meir then wanted to take that Kavachem and produce a further chiddush with it by saying, once we know that the hechsher shchita works to stop a treifa from becoming a nevela, let's extend that through Rabinin Av to Malika as well. Because Malika by a bird is similar to a shchita. It's the hechsher. It's what's machsher. On that, the Gemara said that's taking it too far, because there's a concept of dayay lavoy minadin liyos kanidoin. Whenever you learn anything from a Kavach, you're limited as to what you can learn from that Kavach to the source of the Kavach. The source of this Kavach is the behemoth, the behemoth that's a treifa that was shechted. There, the shechita will prevent it from becoming a nevela. But that's only by a shechita that we know. So since that's the source, you cannot extend that to the Malika Saif. So Reb Meir, who does extend it to the Malika Saif, had to find another source for that. So he did find another source, and the source that he found was a different pasuk. And the Gemara quotes the pasuk, Zois Torah Sabhema via Oif. The Torah compares Tumas Behema to Tumas Oif. Why would the Torah compare Tumas Behema to Tumas Oif if they're so radically different one from the other? So it's a hekesh. The hekesh must come to tell us something that we wouldn't know, and that is whatever is machshir a behema will stop a behema from being tamei, which is the shechita, and whatever will be machshir an oif will stop an oif from becoming tamei. And since by a oif there's two different methods to be machshir it, for oif of chulin there's shechita, and for oif of kachim there's malika, both those activities will prevent a treifa from becoming tamei. So what started off with a kavachomer is no longer a kavachomer. Now it is a hekesh. There's a limit in the Torah from where Reb Meir knows it. Even though the Mishnah quotes Reb Meir with a kavachomer, it seems like once we drill down a little bit, Reb Meir doesn't have that kavachomer. He's relying on the hekesh. Rabbi Yosy, he could rely on the kavachomer because he says through a kavachomer you could learn that by shchita so if the oif is treifa, it will not become tamei, but you can't extend that to malika because of dayai. So he relies on the kavachomer, and therefore he has to limit it. He has to limit it to shchita and not malika. But now comes the question of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says there's absolutely no heter shchita by oif either. But the problem is you have a kavachomer. Everybody agrees that a valid kavachomer should work. So if that's the case, how do we explain Rabbi Yehuda who holds that the shchita of a knife wouldn't even work, even though you have a kavod. It must be Rabbi Yehuda had a pasuk to tell us that the shchita of a knife wouldn't work. And this pasuk is a pasuk that we have been very busy with for the past two blot, because this pasuk is the same pasuk that the Gemara used to teach us something else. So we're going to have a little bit of a machlokes here. Do I use this pasuk to teach me that an oif that's a treifa shchita doesn't help for it, which is how Rabbi Yehuda is going to use this pasuk, or do I use this pasuk to teach me what Rav Meir told us about, which was yesterday or 2 days ago? The Gemara taught us a different limit from the same pasuk. So let's refresh our memory with what that pasuk is and what the two opinions as to how to interpret the pasuk is. So the pasuk says, and this is the main pasuk that discusses the halacha of an oif tahor that became a Neveila, that it becomes tamei. It says, "V'chol nevesh asher toichel Neveila utreifa." This is somebody that's eating a Neveilas oif tahor, but ezech ubager v'chibes begodov v'rachatz pamayim v'tamei hada'ar v'tahor. So this is the pasuk that discusses the tumah of Neveilas oif tahor, and the tumah comes by a asher toichal. It comes through eating. That's how we know it's tumah b'beis abuya. The question that everybody has on this pasuk is, it should say v'chol nevesh asher toichal treif Neveila. Why does it say v'chol nevesh asher toichal Neveila utreifa? Treifa has nothing to do with this. Either treifa is a Neveila or it's not a Neveila. But what does treifa have to do with this? This is a question that is a universal question. The question is how to deal with it. Rabbi Yehuda deals with it as follows. Neveila is to tell us that a Neveila is tamei. That's the Pashup Pshat. Treifa is to tell us that if you had a treifa that you shechted, it will also be tamei. And that's Rabbi Yehuda Shita. That even though you might have a kavod to say that if you have an oif tahor, that's a treifa. If you shechted, it should be tahor, just like we know is the case with the behema. Kamash learned this extra word. V'chol nevesh asher toichel nevela treifa. Even a treifa, even though it's shechted, you become tamei. So that's how Rabbi Yehuda holds halacha. Rabbi Meir can't learn treifa that way, because Rabbi Meir obviously holds that if you shech the treifa, it will become Torah. So Rabbi Meir tells us treifa is teaching us what type of shchita or what will make an oif and nevela. So we learned that just like treifa, there's no difference between if it's in the Beis HaMikdash or out of the Beis HaMikdash. Treifa is possible. Under no circumstances will treifa work. So too, the only type of slaughtering of a bird that would render it an Neveila is only if you slaughtered it in a fashion that would be equally invalid bifnim and bechutz. So, for instance, if the malika that you did would work to allow you to leave the bird on the mizbeach if it was put there mistakenly, so that means the malik had some effectiveness. It's not comparable to a treifa, and therefore tumas ha'oif would not apply. Tumas nevelas oif would not apply, even though it was a pasal malika. But if that pasal malika had some impact, that would be enough that nevelas oif tahor would not apply to it. So that's why this whole sugya hinges on this puzzle. Does treifa teach you that even a treifa will become tamei if it's shechted, which is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, or does it teach you halachas about what type of slaughtering would lead to a neveila? Now, the gaps that are going to have to be filled in here are Rabbi Yehuda also agrees to Rabbi Meir that if the malika did something, there wouldn't be neveila soif Torah. But he doesn't have the pasuk of treifa to teach that to him. So he's going to have to find another source for this halacha. Now the Gemara said, we have a third option of what Neveila Utreifa must be telling you. And Neveila Utreifa must be telling you, just like Treifa, the only type of birds that could become a Neveila and therefore are Tomei, Be'achilas Beis Abliyah, by eating it and swallowing it, are things like Neveila and Treifa, which apply only to a kosher animal. Because a non-kosher animal doesn't need Neveila Treifa to forbid us from eating it. it can't be eaten even if it's not a nevela, even if it's not a treifa. So, but the fact that our pasuk says nevela treifa, that's what's going to make you tamei. Mashma, if they weren't a nevela or treifa, they wouldn't make you tamei. That proves that this whole parsha of nevelas oif only applies to nevelas oif tar. Is metama b'beis abliya, but the nevelas oif tameya, a non-kosher bird, would not be metama b'beis abliya. So now that we have another important limud from this pasuk, so Rabbi Yehuda's out and Rabbi Meir's out because they each had limudim that they wanted to learn from this pasuk, but the Gemara has an overarching purpose for this pasuk to teach us that the parsha of Nevelas Oif Tar does not apply to a Noif Tameh. So the Gemara said that would be a good argument, but it happens to be that we already know from a different source that the parsha of Nevelas Oif Tar does not apply to a Noif Tameh. So since we already know that from a different source, the Nevelo Treifa here are extra, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda can apply it to his limud, and Rabbi Meir can apply it to his limud. What is that extra pasuk from where we know that the parsha of Nevelas Oif only applies to Noif Tahor and not an Oif Tameh? So I'm going to start 5 lines from the bottom of Samach Tesam and Beis. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Yochol Tehei Nevelas Oif Tameh Metame Begodim Abeis Abliya. You might think that the same parsha that applies to Nevelas Oif Tahor should apply to Nevelas Oif Tameh. Talmud Leimer Neveila utreifa lo yoichal. Misha Yisurai mishum bal toichal Neveila yotzer zeh she'ein Yisurai mishum bal toichal Neveila el mishum bal toichal Tameh. So we have a new pasuk. Neveila utreifa lo yoichal l'tamava ani Hashem. So l'tamava tells you we're talking about tama, and it says it only applies to a bird that Isurei Mishum Bal Toichel Neveila. Mashenkin, bird that's not kosher, that's already usher because of Bal Toichel Tam. So now that we have an external drasha to tell us this important piece of information, that Nevelas Oif only applies to Leif Torah and Leif Tameh, we have the pasuk of V'chol Nefesh Asher Toichel Nevelu Treifa, either to apply to Rabbi Yehuda's purpose that tells you even shechting the treifa of an Oif Tar, the animal will still be tamei, or to teach us the limud that we learned from, according to Reb Meir, that it's telling you that even a malika or a shchita that has some positive impact will not render the oif as a nevela, and it will not be metama b'beis habli. So that's where we got up to yesterday. Now the Gemara asks another kasha. The Gemara asks as follows: Hi Nami, Typically, Zok Rashi, what is the question now? What are we challenging now? Hi Nami to be Cheilav Tumeya, typically Nami de Metama. Cheilav Tumeya should be Tame. The Mehechatesa Latira Mehai Kra to Yosel Kamalacha High Lav B'Tameyaksiv. Once you're telling me, so I skipped out one important piece of information from yesterday. And that is, where did the Gemara illustrate to us that the way to analyze the pasuk is by saying that this halacha does not apply to an oif tameh or to behemoth tameh? That was by a pasuk that was talking about a very interesting chiddush. The halacha is up to Torah v'chiyamis min behema. I'm sorry. The Torah says v'cheilav neveila v'cheilav treifa. Let's have a look at this pasuk. V'cheilav neveila v'cheilav treifa yiyaseh l'chol malacha v'achal lo yishuchlu. We know that we're not allowed to eat cheilav. Cheilav is usher for us to eat. It's mutar b'ana, but it's usher for us to eat. Right? That's why we only eat the front half of an animal, so we don't have to be involved with the cheilav. But we sell the back half of the animal to the goy. They use it, so we can have enough of it. We actually are allowed to sell it. Now, what would happen if a kosher behema became a nevela or a treifa, right? So the halacha is a very fascinating halacha. We know that the basar of a behema that dies, a kosher animal dies, is not properly slaughtered. It's a nevela and it's metama b'magav v'masa. But the cheilav of that same animal is not tamei. So the Torah teaches a chiddush that the cheilav of a Neveila is not tummy. What type of Neveila are we talking about? Are we talking about the Neveila of a cow, or are we talking about the Neveila of a horse? A cow is kosher, a horse is not. So this pasuk says v'cheilav Neveila v'cheilav treifa yeh asher l'chol malacha v'achal yishachlu. It's a very big chiddush that cheilav of a Neveila from a behemoth tahora, from a kosher animal, does not become tummy. The Gemara taught us. From there we know. From the word treifa, we know that dafka, an animal sheyesh b'mina treifa, the only type of animal that has this exemption, that it's cheilav, is tar, even though it's Neveila, is an animal that could be disqualified because it's the treifa, meaning a kosher animal. Yotis azu, a non-kosher animal like a horse, shein b'mina treifa, there's no psul treifa because it's also regardless, even if it's not a treifa, it's a behemoth tameya. So that's how we know that this chiddush, that the cheilav of a Neveila is not tamei, that applies only to the cheilav of a kosher animal. But the cheilav of a treifin animal will be tamei. So Frag to Gemara on Amud Beis, the limud of cheilav Neveila and cheilav treifa was from the extra word of cheilav treifa. And we said, since treifa doesn't apply to a behemoth tameya, therefore this pasuk does not apply to a behemoth tameya. But Frag to Gemara, you don't need to look at treifa. Look at the word Neveila by itself. Neveila doesn't either apply to a behemoth tameya, because a behemoth tameya is also, even though it's not a Neveila. So Frag to Gemara, v'han nami, typically may v'cheilav Neveila. Why do I even need the extra word of v'cheilav treifa to teach us that this pasuk is not talking about a non-kosher animal? From the word Neveila, we know it cannot apply to a non-kosher animal, because I can make the same comment. Misha Yisure Mishum Bal Toichel Cheilav Neveila. Yotzes Azu Shein Yisura Mishum Bal Toichel Cheilav Neveila. El Mishum Tamei. This animal doesn't have an Isser Neveila. It has an Isser that precedes it. It has the Isser of Tumah. So our struggle now is we're literally out on a tangent. We're now in the middle of a pasuk that talks about the Cheilav of a Neveila. Nothing to do with our sugi anymore. The cheilav of Neveila, it says the cheilav of Neveila utreifa, you're not allowed to eat it, but it's not tummy. And the question is, why did it say there utreifa? If the whole purpose of it saying there utreifa is to tell us that this halacha doesn't apply by a non-kosher animal, all it had to say was the cheilav Neveila. If it was the cheilav Neveila, yeyasel l'chol malacha v'achal yishachlu, it wouldn't say the cheilav treifa. We would know the same thing. Dafka, an animal that its problem is Neveila, and it's not a behemoth tameya, it doesn't have another problem. And now the Gemara is looking to explain what the word treifa adds in a pasuk that has nothing to do with our sugya, but that's talking about the cheilav Neveila, the cheilav treifa, yeyasel v'chol malacha. Why is this the cheilav treifa? What are we learning from this word? Zok to Gemara mibaye le'suyei chaya. It's to tell us that what about the cheilav of a chaya? Now the cheilav of a chaya is never usher. You're allowed to eat the cheilav of a chaya. You're allowed to eat the cheilav of a deer. So the question is, since you're allowed to eat the cheilav of a deer, it's not really similar to the cheilav of a cow. Now, what if a deer becomes an Neveila? Would its cheilav be tamei or not? We know that the cheilav of a cow that became an Neveila would not become tamei. What about the cheilav of a chaya? Zok to Gemara, so kedai techamina, I might have thought, misha chel ba'asar u'b'soa mutter, dafka a cow, who, when everything goes well and it's checked properly, its cheilav would be aser and its basar would be mutter. Such an animal, the Torah is talking about when the Torah says if it becomes an Neveila, the cheilav does not become tamei. But yotzes hazu, it should exclude a chaya shechel ba'ubasar mutter. The cheilav and the basar of a chaya are both mutter if it was shechted properly. So maybe this pasuk of a cheilav Neveila, the cheilav sheva should not apply to a chaya, and therefore the cheilav of a chaya that's a Neveila should be tamei. Kamash malan, even the cheilav of a chaya is going to be tahor. How do you see that from the word treifa? So Rashi explains that to us. V'shinuyehu li'asuyei chaya tahora shemesa that died shechal b'tahor. The Solkadai, I would have thought, it says you're not allowed to eat the cheilav. The cheilav that we're talking about in the pasuk, that's not tamei, is cheilav that one is not allowed to eat. Misha chelba osor ubesare mutter tiharti la chelba michlal nevela. You know what this pasuk is talking about when it tells us that the cheilav is not going to be tamei al nevela? We're talking about an animal whose cheilav would normally be osor and whose basar would normally be mutter. Avol chaya shechelba mutter kivisor, but a chaya whose cheilav is just like its basar, it's mutter. Maybe when it comes to the tumas nevela, the cheilav of the chaya should be like the basar of the chaya. Kamashnon treifa, kol sheyesh b'minay treifa v'afilu chaya. It says treifa, any species that has the problem of treifa, a chaya, that's a kosher chaya, has the issue of treifa. That also has the exemption that its cheilav will not become tamei if it becomes an nevela. Zot Gemara, I'm challenging you. I disagree with you. I think you're wrong. The cheilav of a chaya is tamei, and I'll challenge you in two ways. First of all, I'm going to ask you the following question: Ma'ishna tmeya, the ein chelba kolach mibesora. Why do you treat a behemoth tmeya different than a chaya? A behemoth tmeya, you agree, its cheilav will be tamei. Why will its cheilav be tamei? Because its cheilav is no different than its basar. They're both asur to eat. Well, chaya nami ein chelba cholak mibesara. A chaya as well, its basar and its cheilav have the same status. So therefore, it should not be included in the chiddush of this pasuk. And the exemption that there's no tumas nevela on the cheilav should not apply to a chaya, just like it doesn't apply to a behemoth tameya. That's number one. So number one is I don't see how it's a muchach from this pasuk. On Amud Beis, we're going to learn this Gemara, and the Gemara is going to make a drasha from a pasuk of a which is the same pasuk we're talking about. The Cheilav Neveila, the Cheilav Treifa. From these words of on Amud Beis, the Gemara is going to darshan that a chaya, the Neveila's chaya, its Cheilav is tamei. So the Cheilav of a Neveila's chaya is in fact tamei. So you can't say Treifa is coming to tell you that this pasuk also applies to a chaya, because as a matter of fact, it doesn't apply to a chaya. So we're back to the drawing board. What do you learn from the word v'cheilav Treifa in the pasuk that's talking about the Neveila of a behemoth? Elo Amar Abaye, we're going to have to come up with another purpose for Treifa, and maybe Treifa ligufei yitzrich. Maybe the word Treifa is to tell us a chiddush. L'tayer Cheilav treifa shamesa. Maybe we need a pasuk to say that if a treifa cow dies, its cheilav is tahor. Well, you might ask me if a treifa dies, now it's a neveila. So why do I need? And the pasuk already tells me that the cheilav of a neveila is tahor. So why do I need a separate pasuk to tell me that the cheilav of a treifa is tahor? Zot Gemara el Amar Abaye treifa lugufei yitzrich. Shaloi Timer, don't say, you might say, let's compare a treifa to a behemoth tameya. A behemoth tameya, a horse, is asur to eat. There's an isra on it even when it's alive. It's a non-kosher animal. And a treifa, an animal that's treifa, even when it's alive, there's already an isra achila on it. Because while it's alive, it could still have a treifa. So maybe we should say a treifa is similar to a behemoth tameya. Ma tameya chelba tamei, just like a behemoth tameya that dies, it's not included in this pasuk of the cheilav being tar. So av treifa, maybe a treifa would not be included in this pasuk of the cheilav neveila, and therefore it should be tamei. That's why it speaks out the cheilav treifa. Even if it was a treifa before it became a neveila, it still has this exemption that its cheilav will be tahor. Freik the Gemara, ihachi hai nami mi boyalei lati the bach ihachi the bach aleph ihachi ti boyalei shaloi taimar ihachi hai nami ti boyalei shaloi taimar. Then if that's the case, let's go back to our pasuk. Our pasuk of Neveilas Oif Tahor, it says v'chol nevash asher toichal Neveila utreifa ve'ezech uveger. So this is the pasuk that tells you about the Neveilas Oif Tahor mitama begodim bebeis abliya. And we just discussed a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Meir had a touch his puzzle. Is treifa telling you that if a treifa was shechted, it also is Neveila, which is what Rabbi Yehuda learns, or is it the other limit that Reb Meir learns? Break the Gemara based on what you just told us. Maybe I need treifa lugufei. So maybe Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Meir are both out of limud. Shalai timer, don't say hoyel v'oiv tamei aser b'achila. Just like a oiv tamei is aser b'achila even when it's alive. Utreifa aser b'achila, and the treifa is aser b'achila when it's alive. Maybe say ma oiv tamei edem tamei. Just like an oiv tamei does not become tamei as in the Neveila oiv Torah to be metamei b'beis abliya. Av treifa edem tamei. So maybe you need to say Neveila treifa to tell us that a treifa will be metama b'beis abliya if it becomes a Neveila. The same argument you're making by the pasuk of the Cheilav of the Neveila, well, you could make that same argument when you're discussing what type of oif has the din of Neveilas oif tar. V'oid, and I got another problem. Mi ikal meilaf treifa mitmeya. How could you learn treifa from tmeya? In other words, you wanted to say earlier that you need treifa because I might have thought that just like a tmeya, just like a behema, tmeya does not have the advantage of its cheilav being tar, so too a treifa, because they both share a commonality that they're both osir mechayim. That's not a good svara. There's a huge difference. Tmeya from the moment it was created, it was osir. Yeah, that's why its cheilav might be tamei when it's in Neveila. But treifa, a treifa wasn't born a treifa. A treifa, there was a time where it was a kosher animal. So therefore, just because a tameo doesn't have this special exemption that it's Neveila, its cheilav will be tamei, but by a treifa, why shouldn't you apply this special exemption that when it becomes a Neveila, when it ends up dying and becomes a Neveila, its cheilav should be tar? The chitema treifa mi batan Michael Meimar. If you can tell me, yeah, you're right about an animal that became treifa while it was alive. But what if an animal was born with a defect? That's no different than a behemoth tamea. And there you would have easily thought that it's just like a behemoth tamea, that its cheilav would be tamei. Zakt Gemara b'mina miya ika. Even if you're going to ask me about a treifa mechayim, it's still less chomer than the behemoth tamea, because by behemoth tamea, there's no possibility of ever having that should be mutter. But by a treifa, this particular treifa that was treifa from its birth, memela, it was always usher. But the isser of treifa, by definition, doesn't mean it's machayim. The isser of treifa occurs most of the time where there was a shasa kosher. So therefore, just because you're going to say that the special carve out that the Torah said for the cheilav of a Neveila, just because it doesn't apply to a tmeya, it should still apply to a treifa. Elo Amarava, we're back to square one. We're literally back to square one on this pasuk that we've diverted our attention from Kachim, and we're on this pasuk of the Cheilav Neveila, the Cheilav Treifa Yasachom Malacha, Bachalai Shechlu. This pasuk teaches us that the Cheilav of a Neveila, of a Behemoth Torah, is not tamei, and we want to know again, why does it stick in the word Cheilav Treifa? It's completely redundant. Elo Amarava, HaTorah Amra. You know what the chiddush is? That iser chalal iser in this case. Yavoy iser Neveila v'yachal iser chelav. The animal, the moment it's born, this part of the animal, the chelav, is also with chelav. So when the animal dies, will there also be a iser Neveila chal on it? Isn't there a halach of ein iser chalal iser? So I bezai, it shouldn't be able to become also mikoyach Neveila. Or if it becomes a treifa, it shouldn't be able to become also for a treifa because it already has an iser chelav on it. And there's a concept of ein yisur chalal iser. So the Torah is stuck in Cheilav Neveila v'Cheilav Treifa to tell us Yava Yisur Neveila v'Yachal al Yisur Cheilav, Yava Yisur Treifa v'Yachal al Yisur Cheilav. If someone eats Cheilav of a Neveila, not only does he get petch for eating Cheilav, he also gets petch for eating Neveila. And the same thing with Treifa. So normally you say ein yisur chalal iser, but here the Torah is telling you a chiddush. Now when it comes to Cheilav Neveila and Cheilav Treifa, Isser is chalal Isser. That's a very powerful chiddush. That's a very powerful chiddush. Gewaltig. Zagt Gemara utrichi. If it already says v'chelav Neveila, so I know that the Isurim will be chal on the Isser of chelav. So, and the pasuk is saying, you're not allowed to eat it, meaning there's an Isser al Neveila here to eat it. So the question is, why did it have to be Cheilav Treifa? Why wouldn't I know just from it saying B'Cheilav Neveila, that the Isser Neveila is Chal on the Isser Cheilav? So Akimor Shrichi, the Yashmin Neveila, if the Torah only told us that the Isser Neveila is Chal on the Isser Cheilav, that's Mishum de Mataba, because there's a Chumrah, there's something called Isser Moisef. The Isser of Neveila is a little bit greater than Cheilav, because it applies to something that Cheilav doesn't. Cheilav doesn't create Tumah. Neveila creates Tumah as well. So that's why it could be Chal on the Cheilav. Aval Treifa, which does not bring with it a Tumah, a Maloi, maybe that wouldn't be Chal upon the Isser Cheilav. V'yashmin in Treifa, and if we only had the pasuk of Treifa, then I would have said, Mishum de Mechusra Mechayim. The Bach changed it. Mechusra Mechayim. There's a deficiency in the animal while it's alive. But Cheilav, there's never a deficiency. Neveila, there's no deficiency. So therefore, that's why the Isser Treifa is Chal on the Isser Cheilav. Of the Neveila Emaloi, Tricha, so that's why the pasuk spoke out, Cheilav Treifa, not to teach you anything about Hilchos Tumah, but to tell us that they both have the Isser of Achal Chlu, meaning they both are Isurim that will be Chal even upon the Isser Cheilav. Okay, now we're going to get back to our Sukha. Rabbi Yehuda was the one who learned from V'chol Nefesh Asher Toichal Neveila Utreifa, that Treifa is coming to tell us that if you shechted an oif that was a Treifa, it still remains in Neveila. Reb Meir, we said, argues. Reb Meir holds for carrot. Say if you shecht, and say if you make malika on an oif, it does not become a Neveila. So what is Reb Meir going to do with the word Utreifa? Now, we already learned 2 days ago blot, so we already know what Reb Meir does with it. But here the Gemara is going to give us a little bit of a chazara. For Reb Meir, hi Treifa, my ovidlei. According to Reb Meir, what do you learn from this extra word Utreifa? It's telling us that if you did a shchita lefnim, since a shchita b'chutz is kosher, so too the shchita lefnim will protect it from becoming a neveila. Because we learned it has to be like treifa. Just like treifa, it's the same in Beis Hamikdash. As it is out of the Beis Hamikdash, so too the only type of slaughterings that will render an oif tar into a neveila is only a slaughtering that would be equally ineffective, say in the Beis Hamikdash, say out of the Beis Hamikdash. And if Baal Shchita is effective out of the Beis Hamikdash, we say that if a bird was shechted even in the Beis Hamikdash, which psula, nevertheless it wouldn't be a neveila oif tar. Practical of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda also agrees to that same halacha. The letter that we learned a couple of blot ago, Rabbi Yehuda agrees to those. But the problem is he doesn't have a pasuk for it because he uses v'cheilav neveila, v'cheilav treifa to teach us that shechting a treifa by an oif does not protect it from tumah. So Rabbi Yehuda treifa achri daksiv. He found another pasuk where it says treifa, and that is neveila utreifa lo yochal l'tumah ba'ani Hashem. So he found an extra word, treifa, and therefore he can apply that to that limit. And so now we're going to go have a little bit of a problem, because whenever we have such a situation, now the Gemara is going, oh, Reb Meir, what is Reb Meir going to do with that extra word, treifa? So he'll say, chad lemute shchita shilafnim, which we just discussed a moment ago. The chad lemute, now we're introducing a new halacha, lemute oif tamei. One is to tell us that the whole concept of neveila of an oif tar does not apply to an oif tamei. Rabbi Yehuda, how does Rabbi Yehuda know that it doesn't apply to an oif tamei? Milevena nafklei. He uses it from the word neveila, as it says in the pasuk. Neveila utreifa lo yochel l'tamava. So the word neveila tells us that it wouldn't apply to an oif tamei, because by oif tamei you don't need the issue of neveila. Zok to Gemara, Reb Meir, hi neveila me'avodla. So now what's Reb Meir going to do with that extra word, neveila, that Rabbi Yehuda used to tell you that it doesn't apply to an oif tamei? Zok to Gemara, lishir achila b'kezayis. To tell us that we're saying, that if you eat neveilas oif tahor, you become tamei, how much of it you have to eat? You have to eat an achila. You have to eat a kazayis. And let's look, we're talking about two psukim over here. There's the flagship pasuk that talks about Neveila Iftar. That's the pasuk we've been discussing. So it uses the word achila there. We've been now focused on a new pasuk of Neveila Utrefa Lo Yoichal. So why don't I need this Lo Yoichal? I have that Asher Toichal to tell me that I need a shir achila. So Gemara, mida avker achmona beloshen achila. It also says a loshen achila there. So Gemara, chad l'shir achila b'kezayis, v'chad l'shir achila b'chte achilas pras. The chiddush is that in order to become tamei by eating an avelas oiftar, you have to eat a kezayis, but you also have to eat it within a specific time frame, which is the shir of kedei achilas pras. And if you didn't, then you won't be tamei. Why? So the question is, why would I think the achilas of a nevelas iftar should be different than any other isser? By every achila, we always say sayed achilas mitzvah or sayed achilas isser. If you didn't need it, achilas pras, you didn't need it, right? So why should tumah be any different? Why should I need a special pasuk by tumah to tell me that it has to be toich kedei achilas pras? Because sol kedat echmina hoyel v'chidishu. This whole concept of nevelas iftar that doesn't make you tummy by touching it, only by swallowing it, it's a wild chiddush. So I would have thought, since it's a wild chiddush, it doesn't have the same gevulim of achila, and therefore Yosy mechdei achilas pras nami l'tamei. Even though you ate a kazayis of an oif tahor that was Neveila, even though it took you much longer than the achilas pras, because about the whole idea is a chiddush, maybe you would become tamei as well. Kamash Mulan, that yes, it's a massive chiddush that eating the meat of a nevelas iftar would make you tamei, but it only makes you tamei if you ate a sheer kezayis b'toich kedei achilas pras. Okay, now we're on to a little bit of a new sugya, but not really.
Tamei requires eating.
The nevelas iftar is a unique tuma. Every other tuma you touch it, you carry it.
Actually requires swallowing.
By nevelas iftar,
You can't, and
it has to go through the
you
part of
can't
your
go in
throat, swallows.
throat and you spit it out. You're not tamei.
Well, it has to go through the base of blia.
Oh,
Once it goes through the base of blia, I don't think you can get it out anymore.
yeah.
That's called past the point of no return.
Well,
I mean, unless you use special
yourself
equipment
to force yourself.
or to throw. Yeah, that's true. But once it passes through there,
Then it's
someone's
done.
tummy.
It's gone through already.
Yeah.
Too late.
That's right. It's like once it goes through the turnstile, it's done. You don't get your fare back, even if you jump back out. Tanu Rabbanim, the Cheilav Neveila, the Cheilav Treifa. So we're going back to the pasuk that talks about the Cheilav of an animal that becomes a Neveila. The Cheilav itself is not going to be tummy. Zok the Gemara becheilav behema toira kosav b'dav. What type of cheilav is exempt from tumas neveila? The cheilav of a kosher animal. You're saying it only applies to the cheilav of a kosher animal. Maybe not. Maybe even the cheilav of a behemoth tmeya is also going to be exempt from tumah. Zok the Gemara amrit tier. Michlal shchuta. We know there's a rule that when you shecht an animal, it's matahar the animal, right? We also know v'tir miklal chelav. We also have a rule that a neveila becomes tahor. The chelav of a neveila becomes tahor. So let's look at this very interesting comparison. Tir miklal shchuta, Rashi says, tir milatame mitam shchuta shashchir mitarasa. We know an animal that you shecht, the shchita stops it from becoming tummy. So you see the concept of a shrita preventing tumah. You also have a concept of cheilav preventing tumah, which is this pasuk. Mitam cheilav tires and neveila milatame shekasav kan shecheilav neveila tar. So you have these two concepts. Shrita has the ability to keep the tumah away, and cheilav has the ability to keep the tumah away. So let's compare the two. Amr tir mechlal shchuta and tir mechlal chelav. So let's compare the two. Makish tir mechlal shchuta. Just like when we say that shechting an animal makes it tar, that's davke b'tayr v'loy b'tmeya. Shechita only works on the behemoth tayr, it works on a cow. Shechting a horse will not prevent it from becoming an neveila. Rashi is there psukim to say that shechita is no different than a bullet to the head when you're talking about a behemoth tameya. Shchita only has its koyach to be poil on an animal that's kosher. So that let's say that same svara should apply to this heter of chelav. Av m'shatir miklach chelav b'tahora v'loy b'tameya. Should only apply to behemoth Torah v'loy b'tameya, which is exactly what we're looking for. That this exemption that the chelav is Torah does not apply to behemoth tameya. That's one option. Or maybe look at it from the other direction. Or maybe look at it from a different perspective. Tiar mechlal neveila, v'tiar mechlal chelav. You find cases where something became tar mechlal neveila, and in other words, we're going to show you an example of an item that a neveila, the tumas neveila doesn't apply to it. So again, this is a very interesting example. If I tell you, I'm going to find you an example of something that tumas neveila doesn't apply to. Can you think of any animal that tumas neveila doesn't apply to? So the Gemara is going to want to know, where did you find such a thing? But there is something out there that tumas neveila doesn't apply to. So tir mechlal neveila, v'tir mechlal chelav. We also have this pasuk that tells us that the chelav of a behema, that's a kosher chelav of a behema, is not tamei. So let's compare the two. Makishatir michlal nevela. Just like the special exemption that we're going to show you exists in an interesting case where there won't be a tumas nevela. That's talking about a tmeya v'loy b'torah. So we're going to find an exemption to tumas nevela that only applies to a behemoth tmeya. Again, we're going to have to find that case. But just like you find such a case, afkashatir michlal chelav. So maybe when the pasuk said that chelav is matar, and the chelav will not become tummy because of tumas levela, maybe b'tmeya v'loy b'torah. Maybe the punkt v'keret. Maybe the pasuk is only talking about a behemoth tmeya and not a behemoth torah. So we're turning it over on its head. You want to say it only applies to a behemoth tmeya. I'm sorry, it only applies to a behemoth tahora and not a behemoth tmeya. Well, I have a perspective where you could look at it from that would show you exactly the opposite. That this chiddush, that the chelav is not tamei, should only apply to a behemoth tmeya and not to a behemoth torah. Amrit Dr. Gemara, no. Avada, you have to say it only applies to a behemoth torah. Why? Kishabah b'derech zu. If you look at it from one perspective, b'tahora, this exemption of chelav being tamei only applies to behemoth torah. And kishabah b'derech zu, but when you look at it from the other perspective, it's going to be b'tameya. So now you can't just use your logic to analyze it anymore. So we need a pasuk. Talmud Leimer treifa. You need the word chelav neveila v'chelav treifa. The extra of the chelav treifa teaches us mish yesh b'mina treifa. The only animal that this exemption applies to, that its chelav of a neveila is not tamei, is an animal that the iser treifa would apply to it. And otzi is a tameya, therefore this cannot apply to a behemoth tameya she'ein b'mina treifa. Behemoth tameya could never suffer from treifa because it's usher to eat even if it's not a treifa. Okay, we'll have to pause. I don't know what time it is. I don't have a watch.
Oh,
What time is it?
not the right. 7:47.
Okay, so we still have a couple more minutes. Zog to Gemara, v'loy otzi es achaya sheyesh b'mina treifa. I'm not going to exclude achaya from this exemption. Why? Because achaya does have a din treifa, right? If achaya is a treifa, it becomes usher. A behemoth tameya, that's a treifa, doesn't become more usher. It was already usher even before it was a treifa. It was a behemoth tameya. But achaya is very much impacted by the iser treifa, because if achaya is not treifa, it's a kosher animal. So I would have thought, and this is the punchline to what we said on Nomad Aleph, I would have thought that a chaya also benefits from this special exemption, that if it becomes an Neveila, its chelev should be tahor. Talmud Leimer v'achaloi soichlu. You know what type of animal this special exemption, that when it's a Neveila, its chelev remains tahor? Only the type of animal that you're not allowed to eat its chelev. Misha chelba asar uvasar mutter. Only such an animal has the benefit of the exemption of this pasuk, that when it becomes a nevela, its chelav remains tahor. This does not apply to a chaya, yotza chaya, shechelba ubesar mutter. Inside its chelav, inside its basar are mutter under normal circumstances, it doesn't benefit from the special exemption. And if it becomes a Neveila, not only is it Basar Tameh, it's Cheilav is Tameh as well, which is what the Gemara said on Amud Aleph, when the Gemara said, the Gemara asked right over here, V'oid, Haksiv v'achal lo sechlu. Now we're learning what this Gemara meant here. V'achal lo sechlu. We're learning it right over here. V'achal lo sechlu mishachal ba'asher b'sar muter yotzer chai shechal b'sar muter. Amalei Rabbi Yaakov bar Abba l'Rava elamayata. Based on what you're saying, Neveilas behema tahora hu de metama Neveilas behema tamei loy metama. We said something very fascinating at the bottom of Amud Aleph, that there's such a thing that a behemoth tameya is exempt from tumas neveila. And remember, I asked, where could you possibly find where a neveila's behemoth tameya would be exempt from tumah? How could you find such a thing? Why? Because we know any behemoth tameya that dies, if it's a horse, if it's a donkey, of course it has tumas neveila. So how could you suggest some behemoth tameya that's exempt from tumas neveila? Amalei. So you know what he answered? Kama sabi shebishtuba. You know how many people had this problem and couldn't figure out what unique case is there where a behemoth tameya is exempt from tumah. But I'll tell you, it's very simple. Seifa also live in the Nevelas oif tameh, and the oif tameh is exempt from the tumah of an oif tahor. Right? We learned that it only applies to an oif tahor. So you find a very interesting example, ironic as it is, that the oif tameh is exempt from the tumas oif tahor. So you find that there could be a tumah that applies to an oif tahor and not to an oif tameh. By Abraham, you don't find it. By if you do find it. Zok to Gemara weiter. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Loi tir Rab Meir ela b'tamimim. That Rab Meir said, if you shecht an animal, even though it's a treifa, it's going to be tar from tumas neveila. That's only if it didn't have a mum. Aval babali mumin, if the animal had a mum, then it would still be a problem. Loi, it wouldn't work. That's what Rabbi Yochanan wanted to say. Rabbi Lozer says, no, afidu b'bali mumin. Even a Baal Mum, the Shchita will help. A Baal Mum doesn't make it a treifa, right? Itmar Nami, Amar Abibi, Amar Rabbi Lozer, Metar Hoyer Rab Meir. Rab Meir was Metar, look at this. B'bali mumin, v'afilu ba'avozin v'tar negoilim. Even if you shechted a goose or a chicken in the base of Mikdash, there's no korban. Now, it can't be a korban, but Rashi says it could be kedushas domim. What if it was hektish, a hektish animal? Even if you shechted that, Reb Meir holds it wouldn't be tamei al tumas neveila. Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah, what about arifes? We know that halacha is by egla rufa. By egla rufa, they have to take an axe and chop the back of the neck off. There and the halacha is that egla is not tamei. What if they didn't use an egla? What if they used a goat? Will you also say similar to this? Just like we're saying over here, shchita on a goose will also benefit from shchita. So maybe the arifa's A should benefit from the arifa. Now, maybe avazim v'tarnagoyim time amai. Why do we say that shchita helps for them? The meaning the ifes to do. Yes, they're not the right type of birds to be makabel on the mizbeach like tarim and b'nei yoina, but at least they're birds. Aval A's lav mina deglahu. A goat is not even the same species as a calf. Maybe you wouldn't extend that protection. Oidilma mina de behema would still an animal. I'm not sure how late we are if we need to stop. It's easy Gemara. We can make a run to the end. Okay, so should we make a run to the end? We should have to do like 2 minutes. It's very easy Gemara.
2 more minutes. You want to run
To the end of the parak.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, so Zok to Gemara. Yosy Rav Dimi v'ka'amar lo lahoshmaitza. Rav Dimi was discussing this suffix. If you knock off if you make a rufa on a goat on a goat instead of on a calf, would it be tar? Amar la'abaye mechlal the egla rufa tahiri. So you're making an assumption that the egla rufa, when they chop off its head, that carcass is not tamei. And you want to know if the benefit of that process that applies to a calf, would it also apply to an ace? So clearly you agree that the egla rufa, after it's killed there, is not going to be tamei. I'm like, yeah, it actually is. I agree with that. Amri dever bi'anai, And then I know how I know, because it says in the pasuk that the egla rufa is a kapara. It says kapar la'amcha Yisrael. So it's a kapara ksiba kakochim, and we know kochim that are mechaper don't have a din tum. So therefore, yeah, the egla rufa is not tame after it's killed, even though it's an animal that was slaughtered with an axe to the back of the neck. It will not be tame. It's not treated like a neveila. Maser Rab Nosson Avud Rav Huna, he asked the kasha, and I'm going to prove to you that the egla rufa is tame, because going back to the pasuk that talks about the neveila of a behemoth tahira, its cheilav is not tame, but it says v'achaloi soichlu. So we learned only ela cheilav, dafka cheilav is going to be tahor. Why? She'aser ba'achila umuter bana. The cheilav is not allowed to be eaten, but it's muter bana. That's what the Torah is talking about. It's not going to be tamei by neveila. But what about cheilav shel shor and nisko, the egla rufa minayin? How do you know that the cheilav of a shor and nisko, which is aser bahana, or the cheilav of the egla rufa, which is aser bahana, how do you know that that won't be tamei? Tamid loimer kol cheilav. Frag the Gemara, v'sol kedaitach egla rufa tahirhi. If you're going to tell me that the egla rufa is tar, so are you going to say that he tar v'chel b'tamei? Are you going to suggest that the meat itself is tar, but her chaylev will be tamei? That I need a special pasuk to tell me that its chaylev is also tar? The whole animal is tar. Why would I think the chaylev is tar? The whole chiddush is, even though the animal is tamei, even though the neveila is tamei, the chaylev is tar. But you're telling me about the egla rufa, the whole animal is tar. So why do I need a pasuk to tell me that the chaylev is tar? Zok Gemara, you're right. If you did the process of the egla rufa, I agree. You don't need any pasuk to tell me that the chaylev is tar, because the arifa itself is matar. Ki stricha. You know why I need a pasuk to say that the chaylev is tar? Heicha de shachta mushchat. Isn't that fascinating? If you made a shchita on an egla rufa, that makes it into a neveila. It's exactly the opposite. If you do the proper process, then it's not a neveila. But if you don't do the proper process, you shecht it, it would be a neveila, and all of it will be tamei except for the chaylev. In fact, why? You shechted it. Like every shchita, just like it works in a treifa, why wouldn't it work on this egla rufa as well? Zok Gemara, you're right. You know what type of chaylev we're talking about? The pasuk is saying it's tahor, and the rest of the animal is tamei. That's talking about an egla rufa that died on its own. It became a neveila, and that's asur bana. Zok Gemara machalal the mechayim asura. We thought that when you chop the head off of the egla rufa, now it becomes asur bana, because the Torah says it becomes asur bana. But if you're telling me even if it drops dead, it became asur bana, that means it's not the killing of the egla rufa that made it asur bana. It must have been asur bana as soon as it was designated as an egla rufa. It must have become asur bana. Is that true? That's exactly the case. I actually was once told at what point the egla rufa has the designation of an egla rufa and it becomes asur bana, but I forgot when that point is. V'naz bin chavraya l'meimar yiridasu l'nachal eisan hiyis rasa. So they designate the egla rufa, it's not asur bana. But once they bring it to the site where they're going to chop its head off, at that point it becomes asur bana. And therefore, if it drops dead, there's nothing to change its status. And therefore, it remains asur bana, but it's not going to be tamei. Baruch Hashem, we were zeichen to finish the 7th parak, and b'lineder hadin lachat hazoiv, b'lineder hadin alach chat hazoiv, b'lineder hadin lachat hazoiv. If you look at tomorrow's Daaf, we're going to see that we're going to get a little bit of a break, because we didn't really, we could have not finished today, but we'll have a lot of extra time tomorrow, it looks like.